The funeral of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most iconic figures in British history, left behind a legacy that has intrigued and inspired generations. Her passing marked the end of an era, and her funeral was a spectacle that drew masses of all walks of life, reflecting her impact on her subjects and the wider world. On the 28th of April, a little over a month after her death, Elizabeth I's final journey through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey was not just a procession, but a vivid tableau of the era she dominated. The events of that day and the subsequent handling of her resting place weave a fascinating narrative about royalty, remembrance, and the respect accorded to one of England's most formidable rulers. Elizabeth I's funeral took place on the 28th of April, a little over a month after she died. Her body was carried through King Street, now called Whitehall, in a large parade all the way through to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried. Hundreds of people joined the procession, ranging from ordinary men and women to trumpeters, Elizabeth's household staff, knights and nobles. The Lady Marques of Northampton led the procession as the Chief Mourner. Westminster was packed with people everywhere, on the streets, in houses, and even on rooftops. Everyone came to watch the funeral, and there was a lot of crying and sadness, unlike anything people had seen before. One of the interesting things about the funeral was the drawings that showed what the procession looked like. There was a model of the Queen, dressed in her official robes, complete with a crown and sceptre, resting on her coffin. The coffin was draped in purple velvet and pulled by 4 black-dressed horses. Above the coffin, a canopy was held up, and noblemen carried 12 banners around it, representing the symbols of the House of York, but not those of the House of Lancaster. Elizabeth I died and was buried with much ceremony. Her funeral service was led by Dean Andrews, and she was initially laid to rest in a vault with her grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, at Henry VII's chapel. But in 1607 her remains were moved to be with her half-sister Mary, marking the unusual case of a Protestant princess buried next to her Catholic sister. This move cost 46 shillings and 4 pence, according to Westminster Abbey's records. Elizabeth's successor, King James I, spent quite a lot, about £1,485, more than a nobleman's yearly income, on a white marble monument for her. Interestingly, this monument was smaller than the one he later made for his own mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Originally, the statue on Elizabeth's monument was painted in vibrant colours, and even the lions at its corners were gilded, though no colour remains today. There's more to discover about Elizabeth's resting place thanks to Arthur Stanley from the 1880s. He was allowed by Queen Victoria to examine all the tombs in the Abbey, a place usually closed to the public. Stanley's exploration revealed insights into the hidden crypts, including the one of the Tudor tombs. In his search, Stanley found a narrow vault with 2 coffins stacked, one on top of the other. He described Elizabeth's coffin in detail. It was well preserved, decorated with a Tudor rose, her initials ER, and the year 1603. The coffin was crafted from oak and elm, and parts of its red silk velvet covering still clung to the wood. This find is a unique glimpse into the final resting place of Elizabeth I, lying directly above her sister Mary. It's a remarkable story that sheds light on the hidden history beneath Westminster Abbey. Thanks to the efforts of Queen Victoria and Mr. Stanley, this adventure into the past is just the beginning, as there are more secrets to uncover about the royal burials in future explorations. The grandeur and solemnity of Queen Elizabeth I's funeral procession, her burial, and the subsequent discovery of her final resting place offer a window into the rituals and reverence of royal funerals. The touching story of her reburial alongside her half-sister Mary I and the creation of a monument in her memory highlights the complex relationships and political dynamics of the Tudor period. Thanks to historical accounts and the diligent work of historians, we gain a deeper understanding of the significance of these events. These explorations into the past not only honour Queen Elizabeth I's memory, but also enrich our understanding of the cultural and historical context of her reign. As we continue to uncover details about the royal burials at Westminster Abbey, each discovery adds a new layer to the rich tapestry of British history. The funeral of Queen Anne Stuart. On the occasion of her death, the Queen left specific instructions for her funeral in her draft of will, expressing her wish to be laid to rest in the same manner and place as her late royal consort. Despite the funeral being officially classified as private, the ceremony was nonetheless a grand affair, with expenses totalling £10,579. The day before the funeral, the Queen's coffin, draped in purple, was transported from Kensington to Westminster in a funeral chariot. This chariot, notable for its large and sturdy wheels, was drawn by 8 robust horses, all adorned in purple hoods to match the sombre occasion. The coffin's journey to Westminster was a significant event, drawing the attention of many. Upon arrival at Westminster, the coffin was placed in the Prince's chamber of the Palace of Westminster, where a vigil was held in honour of the deceased monarch. The Duchess of Somerset was appointed as the Chief Mourner, a role of great honour and responsibility, supported by her husband and another male supporter. The Queen's lady-in-waiting and maids of honour were also present to pay their respects, along with 14 countesses who added to the solemnity and grandeur of the occasion. Each of these women was provided with 26 yards of black crape to fashion mourning veils, adhering to the traditions of the time and marking their participation in the mourning process. The actual burial took place on the evening of the 24th of August, a ceremony steeped in tradition and formality. The Queen's interment was marked by the presence of 100 yeomen of the Guard, who were on duty wearing specifically made black coats. Their presence underscored the significance of the event, as they stood as solemn witnesses to the final rites of their monarch. The service itself was conducted by Francis Atterbury, the Bishop of Rochester, who served as the Dean of Westminster. This choice of officiant was somewhat ironic, given that the Queen had particularly disliked him during her lifetime. Nevertheless, he performed his duties with the gravity and decorum befitting such an occasion. In contrast to her feelings about Atterbury, the Queen might have taken some solace in the music provided by 30 children of the Chapel Royal. These young choristers, dressed in their formal attire, lent their voices to the service, a fitting tribute to a monarch who had held music in high regard. Each child was also equipped with a new pocket handkerchief, a small but thoughtful detail that reflected the attention to ceremony and protocol that characterized the entire funeral. The funeral arrangement extended beyond the immediate royal family and close attendants. Even the Queen's household staff were considered in the preparations, though not all were provided with new mourning garments. A special mourning livery, however, was fashioned for Samuel Stubbs, the Queen's rat killer, highlighting the thoroughness with which the Queen's household was involved in the funeral proceedings. This attention to detail, extending even to the less prominent members of the household, illustrated the comprehensive nature of the funeral planning. One of the more striking aspects of the funeral was the size of the Queen's coffin. Onlookers noted that it was even larger than that of her husband, the Prince, who had been known as a very large and bulky man. The size of the coffin necessitated the involvement of 14 carpenters, all dressed in black coats and caps, to carry it. The burden was indeed a heavy one, both literally and figuratively, as these men bore the weight of the final resting place of a monarch who had reigned during a pivotal period in British history. In addition to the carpenters, 6 dukes served as pallbearers, their role more ceremonial than functional, but equally important in the overall pageantry of the event. The final resting place of the Queen was the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey, a site of deep historical and spiritual significance. As per her wishes, she was laid to rest on the right-hand side of the chapel next to her beloved husband. This placement symbolised not only their personal bond, but also the unity of their reigns, intertwined in history and now in death. The Queen's coffin was positioned close to those of her children, whose bodies lay in a nearby vault beneath the tomb of their ancestor, Mary Queen of Scots. This proximity to her family in death mirrored the importance of her lineage and the continuation of the Stuart bloodline, albeit one that would soon come to an end with her passing. The Queen's funeral, though designated as private, was an event of considerable public interest and historical importance. The detailed planning, the participation of high-ranking nobles, and the inclusion of even the lesser members of the royal household in the mourning process all reflected the significant role that the Queen had played in the nation's life. Her funeral was not just the end of an individual life, but the closing chapter of the Stuart monarchy. The heavy coffin, the vigil in the Prince's chamber, and the final interment in Westminster Abbey were all steeped in tradition, marking the end of an era. In the broader context, the Queen's funeral can be seen as a reflection of the rituals and customs that surrounded the British monarchy at the time. The emphasis on mourning attire, the involvement of various members of the court, and the careful orchestration of every detail were all part of a long-standing tradition that sought to honour the deceased, while reinforcing the continuity of the monarchy. The fact that her coffin was noted for its size and the presence of the children of the Chapel Royal, among other details, all contributed to the lasting impression of the funeral as a significant historical event. In the end, the Queen was laid to rest according to her wishes, next to her royal consort, surrounded by the symbols of her reign and her family. The final image of the Queen borne to her resting place in a purple-draped coffin, attended by the highest-ranking members of her court and her faithful servants, remains a poignant reminder of the solemnity and grandeur that characterised the end of the Stuart dynasty. Queen Victoria's funeral preparations, what was placed in her coffin, and the death mask that she never wanted. Once the Queen had slipped away, Osborne House was closed off to the public. The staff were forbidden from leaving until the new King Edward had finished with formalities. Shortly after, a notice was hung out of the front of Osborne House to large crowds of people and press, and members of the crowd ran through the streets crying and shouting at the top of their lungs that the Queen is dead. The press rushed to report on the story and announce her death to the world, and within an hour the London Evening News had a special edition paper out. The great tom bell of St. Paul's rung across London as people poured out of theatres into the streets to mourn the death of their Queen and sing God Save the Queen. Shops and people began to dress in black to show their respects. However, this was not the get-up the Queen had envisioned for herself. The royal household was in a state of panic. No one was aware of the proper protocol of burying a monarch. The government were panicking that the funeral that the Queen had requested was a far cry from the private candlelit affairs of other royals. She had demanded a full military state funeral. No embalming, no lying in state, no mourning black. She wanted a white funeral, purple and white, with white ponies and gun carriage, and the first burial of a monarch outside of the confines of Westminster Abbey and St George's Chapel since George I. Those in charge of organising royal ceremonies and processions, those in charge of the royal household, both disagreed on how to proceed and who should take the lead on the arrangements. Adding to the complexity of the Queen's death, the new royal household of the King refused to take over responsibility until the Queen was buried, out of respect for his mother. But the problem with this was that by this point, the old Queen's household no longer had any authority. The Accession Council was hurriedly assembled, where the Lord Mayor had to be forcibly cast out, and to the dismay of those present, the King improvised his accession speech. It was well known among the family that the Queen had disliked the use of death mask, so when the Kaiser ordered her to have one, it caused uproar. The Queen's household fell into disarray. Everyone was falling out or falling ill, and the Duke of York came down with a dangerous illness. The royal undertaker arrived from London, but he forgot to bring the coffin. The Lord Chamberlain refused to cooperate with the Earl Marshal, and the Kaiser, clearly under stress, turned on the Bishop of Winchester, the Queen's favourite cleric, threatening to haul him out into the gardens and shoot him. The Queen's assistant private secretary arrived in London, only to discover that nothing had been arranged by the Earl Marshal. With only a few days before the expected funeral, he contacted the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army to organise the military as he saw fit. The royal coffin was built by a local carpenter and delivered to Osborne House. The Dr. Reed and the Queen's devoted dresser prepared the Queen for her coffin. The Queen had refused to be embalmed, but the smell and moisture still needed a solution, so charcoal was used instead to cover the floor of the coffin. They cut off her hair, dressed her in a white silk dressing gown with a garter ribbon and star, and placed her wedding veil over her face. The royal dukes, the Kaiser, and the new King lifted her body into the coffin. Dr. Reed and Mrs. Tuck carried out the Queen's secret instructions without any family present, meaning her children would never know of her requests. Her personal servant placed his mother's wedding ring on the Queen's finger, alongside a photo of himself, a lock of his hair, and a handkerchief. The Queen was now ready for her final journey. The event was finalised finally, and 33,000 soldiers had been organised to perform and needed feeding. The common people feared the impact of a year of mourning on their businesses, and it was requested that this be reduced. And those that lived close to the procession offered up their balconies for a hefty sum. On the 1st of February 1901, the entourage crossed the Solent. They were surrounded by 11 miles of battleships and cruisers, each ejecting their minute guns in salute of the Queen. The Alberta, a tiny yacht, bared the Queen's coffin, and the entourage stayed in the harbour overnight before travelling by train to London Victoria Station in the early hours of the 2nd of February. This was followed by the largest military procession, lasting 2 hours through Hyde Park to Paddington. The final procession waited, and the Queen's coffin was placed high onto the gun carriage, drawn by 8 white and cream ponies, of whom refused to walk at first due to the miserable freezing weather, before breaking away suddenly, nearly toppling the coffin to the ground. A new royal tradition emerged out of the chaos. The horses would not be reharnessed, so the 138 bluejackets joined arms, attached ropes to the carriage where the harnesses had been, and dragged the gun carriage to St George's Chapel by hand. The service was not without error either, and the archbishops were early and waited patiently with half an empty nave, due to errors made by the Earl Marshal. The official service was followed by a heartfelt ceremony for the family on the 4th of February. The Queen had built a mausoleum for the husband, Albert, at Frogmore, and she was slowly lowered into the crypt to be laid to rest beside her beloved Prince Albert. In a sequence of meticulously orchestrated events, the world witnessed the solemn passing of an era as the news of Queen Elizabeth II's death reverberated across continents. The plans laid out for this sombre occasion were executed with precision, as dignitaries, family members, and officials were informed in a carefully choreographed sequence. Amidst the backdrop of Buckingham Palace and Balmoral Castle, the unfolding of these moments painted a poignant picture of a nation and a monarchy in transition. As the clock ticked away on September the 8th, a historic and poignant series of actions and announcements brought the curtain down on a remarkable reign, ushering in a new chapter in the annals of British history. Let us delve into the details of this extraordinary day, exploring the unfolding events that marked the end of an era and the dawning of a new one. Elaborate preparations for the event of Queen Elizabeth II's demise were thorough. They were consistently reviewed and modernised. On the 8th of September, these plans were executed with precision. However, not every eventuality could be predicted. Balmoral Castle, despite its impressive neo-Gothic facade, offers a more intimate setting in contrast to the vastness of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. This is one of the reasons the late Queen had held deep affection for it. The private living spaces and official chambers are in close proximity. Hence, on the morning of September the 8th, it's safe to assume that most individuals at Balmoral were well aware of the momentous unfolding of events as the Queen's life quietly waned. Just 2 days prior, with her signature smile in place, despite leaning on a walking stick, she had named her 15th and final British Prime Minister, Liz Truss. However, an announcement made shortly after 6 p.m. the following evening, indicating the Queen's postponement of a virtual Privy Council meeting on medical advice. This raised concerns. The imminent passing of a monarch is a significant constitutional affair, and Downing Street would have been promptly informed about her deteriorating health. Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, and Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, assumed crucial roles in liaising between the palace and Downing Street. During that evening, Case relayed the message to Truss that there existed a distinct possibility of the Queen's condition worsening rapidly. As Truss diligently worked on the energy statement, her inaugural and primary act as Prime Minister, she couldn't help but be conscious of the potential overshadowing, as sources suggest. For any personnel at Windsor who may have been uncertain about the gravity of the situation, the departure of the Queen's helicopter from Windsor Castle shortly before 7 a.m, transporting the Prince of Wales from Dumfries House in Ayrshire, where he was staying overnight, to his mother's bedside, would have undoubtedly caught their attention. Charles arrived at Balmoral just before 10:30 a.m, and the Duchess of Cornwall was driven from the nearby Birkhall to join him. Meanwhile, the Princess Royal, already in Scotland for her engagements, was already present. Within Downing Street, Case was unequivocal about the imminent arrival of distressing news, potentially within a matter of hours. Truss, still in the process of packing her belongings for the transition to Downing Street, had aides dispatched to her Greenwich residence to locate appropriate black attire, as detailed in the biography Out of the Blue. Truss was in the midst of a reshuffle when the palace initiated its pre-arranged cascade communications system to inform key government figures. One minister recounted entering their new department and being informed bluntly, "You have a meeting of 30 minutes. Officials used straightforward language, conveying their anticipation of the Queen's impending passing. The minister's immediate task was to receive a prompt briefing on the so-called London Bridge plans. Reflecting on the experience, the minister remarked, "It felt like a baptism of fire for me. I hadn't supported Liz, and I was expecting to remain on the backbenches, and suddenly I was not only grappling with changing departments and taking on a new role, but I was also instantly involved in one of the most high-profile operations globally. Signs of trouble reached the broader public in an unlikely setting, the House of Commons, where mentions of the Queen were rare. Truss had concluded her initial statements and was attentive to Sir Keir Starmer, Nadine Sawaley, and new Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, quietly entered the chamber and positioned himself between Kawasi and Truss. He handed a note to the Prime Minister, then discreetly exited. Almost immediately, murmurs spread along MPs, sensing the gravity of the moment. Labour's Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, received news next, passing a note from outside the chamber. She gave it to the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who looked visibly concerned as she read it. The note was straightforward, without any hidden references to London Bridge. It conveyed, "The Queen is unwell, and Keir needs to leave the chamber for an immediate briefing." Rayner strived to convey the urgency without causing undue disruption to Starmer's ongoing discourse, though she noticed Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle signalling that she should interrupt him. At 12:32 p.m, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. The Queen's medical team has expressed concern for Her Majesty's health and recommends she remains under medical supervision. The Queen is comfortable and currently at Balmoral. Hugh Edwards of the BBC, donning formal black attire, relayed the news to the general public. A scheduled call between Truss and French President Emmanuel Macron for the evening was cancelled. For family members of the Queen who were not already at Balmoral and unaware of the rapid decline, making the decision to gather presented a dilemma. Arriving too early could incite undue alarm, while arriving too late might mean missing the chance to bid farewell. When Buckingham Palace issued a statement at 12:50 p.m, indicating the departure of William, Andrew, Edward and Sophie for Scotland, the seriousness of the situation became starkly evident. Around 2 p.m, in a separate announcement, the Sussexes, who were residing at Frodmore Cottage during a visit to the UK for an awards ceremony, also revealed their intention to travel to Scotland. 2 hours later, as it became apparent that Kate would be staying at the Cambridges' new residence in Windsor, where their 3 children were still adapting to their new school, it seemed that plans for Meghan to accompany Harry had been abandoned. Considerable speculation arose regarding Harry's absence from the jet that departed RAF Northolt at 2:40 p.m, with his brother and uncles on board. There were indications that the flight might have been initially scheduled for 1:30 p.m, However, no explanation has been provided for the delay. In any case, Harry embarked on a separate journey, departing from Luton Airport on a private jet at approximately 5:30 p.m. He was still in transit when the announcement of the Queen's passing was officially made at 6:30 p.m. Subsequent revelations from the public release of her death certificate weeks later revealed that the Queen had passed away at 3:10 p.m. Dr. Douglas Glass, her official physician in Scotland, who also held GP clinics for Balmoral staff, declared her deceased. The cause of death was attributed to old age, and Dr. Glass disclosed that there had been concerns about the Queen's health for several months, noting, "It was anticipated, and we were well aware of what was to come." William and the other members of the royal family touched down at Aberdeen Airport at 3:50 p.m, a mere 40 minutes after the Queen's passing. Guided by William at the wheel, they made their way to Balmoral, arriving at 5:06 p.m, an hour and 25 minutes ahead of the public announcement. During this time, the formal process of disseminating the news was already in full swing. An internal palace team was actively reaching out to all individuals who required immediate notification. Number 10 Downing Street, Lambeth Palace, the Chief of the Defence Staff, Prime Ministers and High Commissioners of the other 14 countries where she held the position of Head of State, among others. A staff member affixes a notice regarding the passing of Queen Elizabeth II to the gates of Buckingham Palace in London on the 8th of September. Upon Harry's touchdown at Aberdeen Airport at 6:45 p.m, the global populace was already aware of the solemn news. In the aftermath, Buckingham Palace refuted assertions that Charles or his team had faced difficulties in reaching his younger son prior to the public announcement. The spokesperson for the newly crowned king emphasised, the public was informed only after each family member had been duly notified, as was relayed during that period. Harry ultimately reached Balmoral by 7:52 p.m, and by this time Charles had issued a personal tribute expressing his sentiments for the departed monarch, a mother, grandmother and great-grandmother. Outside the premises of No. 10 Downing Street, preparations were underway for a podium. Clad in the black attire sourced by her aides, Truss took to the podium at 7:07 p.m. She somberly remarked, "This signifies the conclusion of the Second Elizabethan era." This day marked the culmination of an unquestionably historic chapter as well.